So today we're going to explore the consumer, but through the prism or the lens of business. So I touched upon the product return of the consumer that ultimately would be the fruit of the questioning that we're engaged with. So just to reinforce this, that if we are talking about or asking questions about the way how we produce ourselves, this is not as an idle pastime. There's obviously intentionality in reference to the questioning that we're engaged with, and that is the product return of the consumer, where people give notice, and through giving notice, they put on notice. And so that, as I've talked about, becomes a signal or a sign of something, because it's a conversation that no one can own, and so that conversation cannot be branded. And so as a result of that, when you're looking at this, you're looking at, once again, the excluded middle is underwrites demand and supply and demand, and so price. And so, but once again, because we don't recognize existential arbitrage as the principal trade, we have to start with goods and services, because it's through goods and services, or the way how business communicates us, reinforces the agency that we're credited. So in order to potentialize a civilizational domain, or essentially what would be a movement beyond that totalizing claim of a buyer's journey, you have to start at the end market. So that means to say that any signal that would otherwise be related to demand is ultimately not demand, it is a command. So the business, or what would otherwise be businesses, would have to be receptive to a command. And that's what we're going to explore. We're going to drill down into the specifics of this. So we can look at the principal dogma of a customer first orientation. So usually this is a platitude or a dogma or a maxim of business that is not questioned. So, you know, if you're orientated towards business, it's always about providing what your customer needs. And so you have a customer first orientation. Ultimately, when you're looking at the way how you're sold on when you're orientated towards the customer, you're sold on the consumer first. So the consumer acts under a miraculation, and so business never approaches what they do in reference to the consumer, because they're always got that customer first orientation. And so that is defined by what they offer. So when you're looking at the way how a product return puts on notice, it gives notice to put on notice, then ultimately you're looking at that orientation. So what, and this is where there is we have to rethink everything, because ultimately, if I was to say that the entrepreneur's task or their risk is that they have to risk a customer first orientation, this will not make sense. Because once again, if the opportunity is defined by a niche or a market, you're not looking at the opportunity for life. So if people are saying to you, we're giving notice of the product return, and through giving notice, we're putting on notice the way how you communicate to us to reinforce the agency that we're credited as a demand center, or as a credit instrument, or as a consumer. So in that case, a business cannot have a customer first orientation, because that presupposes the production of the consumer. All right. So that means to say that in order for people to be communicated to, the business has to demonstrate, all right, through their actions, a way that they're going to do justice to people, and the way how that their risk that they take is subordinate to the principal risk people take when they transcend the totalizing claim of a buyer's journey. So what happened, I'm not covering this off now, but the way how that you can look at it is you've got this conversation that's occurring. So what you have the no ones of the world that are talking to each other, and obviously then business becomes receptive to that conversation, but they can't monetize goodwill, because they have to animate goodwill, and they have to animate goodwill through their actions to potentialize the relationality that would otherwise be the mainstay of the commercial paradigm. Okay, so that is key when you're looking at the risk, because they have to demonstrate something to people for people to be receptive, to see that what they're doing is that you're creating what is a commonality that people would share in a civilizational domain. So because people are always communicated to as a demand center, then ultimately a business have to demonstrate, not talk to them, not orientate to them in a way, but have to demonstrate through their actions. And so this is where I talked about the way how that business have to animate goodwill off the balance sheet to potentialize the relationality. So, when you're looking at loyalty, business obviously seeks to monetize people's loyalty, and because through the reduction of the relation to want, because you're potentializing a relationality beyond the commercial paradigm, that ultimately relates to the way how people become co-creators. And so the risk that a entrepreneur has to take is they have to risk the customer, all right, through not being sold on the consumer. And so therefore potentialize what would be the relationality beyond the consumer's redundancy. Now this will seem fucking insane. And so therefore this is the way how we have to frame it. So in that way, and we can explore that if the consumer is given and it's a risk-free proposition, the risk that business takes obviously is in reference to what they don't question when the consumer works under a miraculation. And this obviously relates to the way how money becomes a tool for thinking their enterprise. So when you're introducing an off message, so you've got the product return of the consumer that is a totally off message, and what they do goes against basically the paradigm, and the paradigm relates to the way how that you use money as a tool for thinking, or the way how that you use money that discounts people. Because ultimately, if you're orientated towards using money as a tool for thinking, you're not thinking about people holistically when you're seeking to generate a return on their agency. All right, so as I've said, that the constancy of agency when you're looking at, say, a present discounted value, that remains the same irrespective of the risk of an investment, because in order for you to generate a return, it's the agency that remains the same over the lifetime. All right, it doesn't matter as far as because that agency relates to the consumer. So you could say a entrepreneur risks because they obviously risk their capital for a venture, but that because they're sold on the consumer. All right, they have a customer first orientation because they're sold on the consumer first. So the business owner is always sold on the consumer, that the consumer will be there. But now you've got this scenario where people are putting on notice, they're giving notice to put on notice to product return, and so you cannot fail safe for that principal product. And so therefore the business has to demonstrate through their actions that they're going to risk that customer first orientation. And so that means to say that they're risking their enterprise for it to become, from it being a commercial one to becoming a civilizational one. The civilizational enterprise relates to potentializing or actualizing the redundancy of the principal product of our economy, which is the consumer. So this is the way how that you look at it. And so if you're looking at signs, so that you've got to think that it works on signs. So the product return is a sign, and then the way how a business would animate goodwill off the balance sheet. So that is the way how that it works off the indistinction of the way how that we would otherwise look at the loyalty programs, which I covered on business. But the business has to be part of an ecosystem to give context to the way how a thing is given, okay? Because if it's not within reference to the totalizing, say, civilizational enterprise, then obviously people associate it with the tactics of business to generate the lifetime loyalty associated with the business and not the civilizational enterprise. And that is always the key consideration when you're looking at what a business has to do. So let's say, for instance, that you're an entrepreneur, but you want to contribute to you want to be a benefactor for, say, humanity. Well, you might look at what you do in reference to a social good that you can just add on as a supplementary good to obviously the principal orientation of a return. Now that doesn't risk obviously the consumer here, does it? It doesn't risk the customer, because what you're doing is that you're just leveraging people's aspirations for change, or like, say, a meaning that is added onto their consumption, and so therefore people can align with their values. But once again, if people are aligning their purchasing with their values, but they don't look at the principal trade or existential arbitrage, then that externality or the good that's added on is just legitimizes the totalizing claim of a buyer's journey and just adds value to it. Okay, so the difference between a social enterprise and a civilizational enterprise is obviously the animation of creativity. So in the case of an entrepreneur that has a different way of addressing you as a person, that's a creative enterprise, that's a creative action. So you have you have the product return of the consumer, and then you obviously have businesses within an ecosystem that are potentializing through what we would think, or what you would think would be that they give, and it's not. It's the emission of the credit, all right, that is telling in here, which I talk about at length. So to remove credit, you've got to think of what happens when we're looking at a way of substantiating human action not based upon the tool of money, or the way how that we use money as a tool for thinking. So if the way how that business is thinking about their enterprise is not in reference to a return but a releasement, they cannot use money as a tool for thinking what they do. Okay, so the first initial action of that is demonstrated to this people that are part of the no ones of the world, or the ones that create the world. It's given as a unifying principle, or people that understand the way how they produce themselves. And so as a result of that initial fruit is demonstrative of the fact that the business is no longer considering their business to be a commercial, or so it's a commercial and then you've just got a social good that's added onto, but is actually considering it to be civilizational. If it's considered to be civilizational, and you're looking at the way how you're creating a creative civilizational domain, that means to say that they cannot use money as a tool for thinking. That means to say they have to, because why? Well, the proxy of goodwill. If you're looking at always the way how the use of money conceals goodwill, they obviously have to demonstrate that, and that's the way how you're releasing goodwill from the proxy that would claim it. And so therefore the way how that the business owner would consider what the nature of what they're doing. It's not in reference to a good or a service as much as that's what they do. It's the way how that good or service is connected into a unifying structure that gives context to what they do. So the way how it becomes an integral part of a civilizational bequeathal. Okay, so that is key when you're looking at the difference here. So in that way, so that animation, that act of, of omission or the exception, what that does is that it's animating goodwill, but through it being part of an ecosystem, it's not captured as an asset. Why is that important? Well, if it's not captured as an asset, so it's not monetized, it means it potentializes the civilizational domain. And so therefore what it's doing, if it's potentializing people, it's potentializing the spirit of people. And this is where I cover off where you're looking at the way how that you're taking goodwill to potentialize a relationality, and the way and the question of gratitude. So in reference, the way how gratitude is not predicated upon receiving, but it's based upon receiving, but it's something that you can't possibly receive, or you can't trace the genealogy of the one that gives. All right, and so that's the way how that the ancestor becomes lost, because what happens through turns that are taken is that you have all these turns that are animating, say, a dynamism or goodwill to potentialize the way how gratitude obviously gets compressed into a reverence, but in the way how that the artifacts of goodwill that are ultimately predicated by exchange. So the way how a person gives to receive, but then that changes through the nature of what underwrites that interpersonal exchange, and the way how you receive yourself, as it were. Now the way how you receive yourself is in reference to obviously the ancestors that come before you. And so the reverence that you would hold them in, if people are contributing to a way that actually transforms people's lives. And ultimately the way how that this occurs is through the way how all these individual acts are potentializing the reception of people as otherwise than being the consumers that they are. So, so in the way the way how that that culture or goodwill does not become an asset, the way I frame this is that it's the way our business funds the relation beyond the reduction. So they literally do fund it. Obviously, there's a cost associated with that because they do not receive money. But so therefore you can look at it as a way of funding the relation. And so in turn, there's a cost associated with it. But the cost is subordinate to the principal opportunity cost of our economizing actions. So there's an opportunity cost when we receive time that's given as an economic good, because ultimately we do have a choice on the way how time's given to us, and it's because we've externalized that we don't give the significance to our actions. And so in turn, if you're looking at the way how that, if a business is going to fund the relation beyond the reduction, they're funding the relation that is no longer reduced to want, and because they're not monetizing what a person is credited when they're given as a demand center or as a consumer. And so in turn, that funding funds what comes after. So if you think that, let's say you're a entrepreneur and you want to, you want to fund some social good, well, a social good is added on. This is different because you literally are funding the very relationality of the commercial paradigm beyond the reduction to want. Now, that means to say that you're animating a dynamism that is literally precluded through social goods that are added onto the buyer's journey set, or addressing externalities when it relates to ecological kind of destruction or anything else like that. So this is a difference between what is a social enterprise and what is a civilizational enterprise, because you're ultimately potentializing the relationality of the civilizational domain. And so in that way, to risk the customer is to risk the consumer through no longer having a customer first orientation is a risk that entrepreneurs take, but it's within an ecosystem of other businesses. And so one of the things that you can look at is the way how that, not only that you understand the way how you produce yourself, but the way how that ultimately any person that wants to set up a business and bequeath an artful, creative way of life to their descendants, and the way how that they could give more meaning to what they do, that obviously requires its own understanding of the significance of an enterprise in reference to that end. And so that requires its own way of understanding the difference between using money as a tool for thinking and the way how that, through animating goodwill off the balance sheet and funding the relation beyond the reduction, you are potentializing the relationality that is obviously going to reduce the cost associated with the civilizational domain, because any cost at all is always subordinate to the opportunity cost of people's economizing actions. And we know that. It makes perfect sense when you think that if you predicate your actions based upon money making, obviously you legitimize the use of a credit you are not the originator of. And so therefore, in turn, if you're orientated towards animating a creativity that you're not credited when you're giving as a demand center, this changes the natures of credit in that civilizational domain. And this is where the use of distributed ledger technology and the difference between the ownership of credit and credit of ownership occurs, because it unifies within that sphere that's not shared outside it. It's very much unifies and it excludes, because it's based upon an aberrant spirituality. And so this is really what we're kind of exploring when we're looking at the way how any change can be temporalized in place, because these businesses are obviously in a place. All right, so if the more businesses belong to an ecosystem in place, then the more that you're potentializing the steps that people would take that would no longer be a buyer's journey. And so therefore it's the way how that you're looking at the structure of ownership that relates to the civilizational domain. And that's what we'll kind of cover off in future episodes.